Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to U.S. History. This is Mr. Carter, and we are working our way towards the end of the school year. We only have a couple more units left, and we're working our way not only to the end of the year, but also to the modern day in the class. And for this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about the decade of the 1980s and some of the changes that happened during the 1980s. And this is kind of near and dear to my heart because this is the era when I was your age. So I went to high school in the middle of the 1980s. Many of your teachers did as well. And so we can appreciate this time frame, what it meant to the nation, and I would like to share some of those things with you right now. So to start off with the concept of this unit, which is really looking at a shift in American political philosophy to the conservative side. So moving towards conservatism, we have to first define what the two sides of this spectrum are. So if you think about American politics, you have liberals and you have conservatives, and those are loosely associated, liberals with Democrats, conservatives with Republicans. And let's talk a little bit about what each one of those means in terms of a political philosophy. If you tend to be a liberal person, you generally think that the government should be involved in regulating the economy, should be involved in helping out those that are less fortunate, should be involved in taxing those that have more to help pay for those that have little, but that government should stay out of social issues. So issues related to your sexual orientation, issues related to a number of different things related to kind of societal issues, moral issues, should be left up to the individual, and government should stay out. If you're a conservative, on the other hand, you tend to think that the free market should control the economy and government should be out of it. So businesses should be able to make the decisions that they want to make. They should be able to recoup the money and not have much of it taxed. That the wealthy should not be responsible for paying huge amounts of sums in to help other people, but they should be able to reinvest that money into their businesses. But you do think that religion and in part the government should regulate social issues. So there should be bans on potentially things like abortion, bans on things like same-sex marriage and things of that sort. Now these are very loose definitions. You can certainly be a Republican or a conservative or a liberal or a Democrat without being exactly what I've just described. But that's the shift that I want you to understand, and that's the spectrum, because it's important when we talk about what happened in the 80s to understand that we were moving from kind of a liberal era in the 60s and 70s when we talked about all the protests and moving towards different rights and things of that sort to kind of a backlash, a swing of the pendulum to the other side of being more conservative. So what led to this revival of the conservative movement? Why did we shift our way over to the right or towards the conservative side of things? And so there were a number of reasons that led to that. The first was that the New Deal, if you remember that from FDR back in the 1930s and 40s, trying to deal with the Great Depression, that a number of those New Deal entities and agencies and things like that led conservatives to lose their influence and really were big government programs which the conservatives didn't agree with, and it required a huge amount of income and a huge amount of taxes that conservatives didn't feel comfortable with. Then we also had the Cold War, which really was a battle between two philosophies, and it required kind of the America First mentality that many people felt was important to try to focus on how we could win the Cold War versus the communists. It was also a reaction by a lot of people to the protest movements. So we talked about the protest movements of the 60s and 70s. Many people didn't feel like those were issues that we were ready to tackle. Many felt that the protesters were being too aggressive and felt like that they did not want to move that fast towards changing American society. We also had the rise of the suburbs. People were moving out of the cities and moving into the suburbs, generally focusing on areas that were more affluent, tended to be segregated based on race. And you also had the religious right, a growth of people moving towards religious fervor, and the religious right being that conservative philosophy that religion should be a guiding force into the decisions that we make. So all those were reasons why we moved towards a conservative approach in the 1980s. And really the shining star, the leader of this movement was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was an odd choice to be leading this particular movement because of his background. And that was that he was an actor. He was an actor in Hollywood. He did a bunch of B movies and he did a bunch of TV shows and things like that. And from about 1940 to 1960, he was a pretty active actor. And then he got involved in right politics of the conservative side. And that really became an issue when we were going through the Red Scare. So if you recall, during the Cold War, the Red Scare, worrying about communism, worried about communists taking over the country, that was something that Reagan was involved in, and it led him to being a voice for the conservative movement. He was elected governor of California in 1966, so right in the middle of all that protest stuff that we were talking about, he was elected the governor of California, and he was one of the people that dealt very harshly with the student uprisings, especially at California, at Berkeley, UC Berkeley. He came in, he brought in the California National Guard to clear out students and became kind of a hero of those people that didn't agree with the protest movements. He was also incredibly well spoken. Being an actor by trade, he could speak well. He was a very good public speaker, and once he became president, he actually was known as the great communicator. So the election of 1980 is really where Ronald Reagan started to shine. That's when he became president. He was going up against the incumbent, Jimmy Carter, who was the president from 1976 to 1980. And Carter had really had a lot of issues that had hit him. Financial issues, issues related to what was going on around the world. We had hostages in the country of Iran. A whole bunch of things were happening, and Carter was not a particularly effective nor popular president. And Reagan really he got the support of the social conservatives, the people that wanted to kind of move back to a more bare-bones, religious-based worldview. And he also started off with a great line that he asked all Americans to consider, and that was, are you better off now in 1980 than you were 4 years ago in 1976 when Jimmy Carter was elected president? And most people said no. And it led to a huge sweep of Republicans, not only at the top of the ticket, being him, the president, but also all the way down as well. So we kind of moved back towards the Republican or conservative side in the election of 1980, and he became our president. Some of his policies, we're going to break these policies up into domestic policies. Now remember, domestic policies are one that deal with what's happening within the United States. And then we'll talk a little bit about his international or foreign policies, which obviously deal with outside the United States with other governments. But let's talk about domestic policies first. He started something called Reaganomics. And Reaganomics was his economic system that involved what's called trickle-down economics. The idea that you want the wealthy to have lots of money, and if they have the money, they will invest it, and that money will trickle its way down the system, and everyone will get a piece of it. So the poor won't get money directly from taxes or from welfare or things like that, and he cut social programs accordingly. But what they would do is the money going back into the system and back into the businesses would lead to the poor becoming wealthy as the money trickled down. Didn't really work. One of the things that was involved was the deregulation of industries, and so essentially what he said was the government's not going to be involved in regulating different parts of the economic system. And he also rolled back environmental rules. So the environmental rules that had come in especially in the 1970s to try to protect our water and our air and our wetlands and things of that sort, he rolled back those because he felt those were bad for business. And then he also moved to have a number of conservative judicial appointments. So people that he was able to put into courts that ultimately would decide on the merits of laws were very conservative and agreed with his worldview. Interestingly enough, in kind of an ironic twist, one of these conservative judges was Sandra Day O'Connor, who's pictured here, who was our first Supreme Court justice that was a female, first woman Supreme Court justice. And even though that was a big move for kind of breaking the barrier of gender in the Supreme Court, she was a very conservative judge and believed mostly in Ronald Reagan's policies. In terms of his foreign policy, he was a staunch anti-communist, and he really felt that the Soviet Union and the communist satellites that supported the Soviet Union were the evil empire, and that's what he called it, the evil empire. So, not only were these people that were different than us and happened to be our enemies, but they were evil. They were truly bad human beings, and that's the way he looked at the worldview, and a lot of people agreed with him on that. he felt it was really important for us to have a very, very strong military. And so he started ramping up. After Vietnam, just to step back for a second, after Vietnam, we had really cut the military budget. But Ronald Reagan, started in the early 1980s to really ramp up the military budget. And so there was a huge amount of spending from the budget on military issues, making sure that we had plenty of troops, tanks, and weapons to face down the evil empire that was communism. He, which is kind of different than the way that conservatives had done it in the past, felt very comfortable doing what's called deficit spending. That's essentially spending money that you don't have, running off a deficit. The United States has a huge deficit, or a debt. It's in the trillions and trillions of dollars, and this started well before Reagan, but Reagan added to it in a big way. He essentially spent money to build up the military that he didn't have, because essentially he was cutting taxes at the same time to give that money back to the industries. And he essentially had something called the Reagan Doctrine, which was that he was going to face the Soviets in these little wars, kind of like we had in Korea and like we had in other parts of the world, Vietnam, for example, and he was going to make sure that we held them to a standstill. Sometimes we did that overtly, and sometimes we did it covertly using the CIA. Then another thing he focused on was something called Star Wars, which was a anti-ballistic missile program that was launched into space. And of course, in the early 1980s, the Star Wars movies were very popular, and so this was kind of a name that was given to it. But the idea was that he would be able to launch satellites that could shoot down Russian missiles before they came in contact with the United States, and that would keep us protected. That was a lot of times thought as a real long shot. There was huge amounts of money poured into it, and it never really got off the ground. One thing that Reagan did, though, because he was such a good communicator and such a personal individual, was he felt that if he could meet with people, he could get them to his side. And right about the time Reagan came into power, just a little bit later, kind of in the very first part of his second term in 1985, the Soviets appointed a new leader as well, named Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev was certainly a new era leader. He was younger than most Soviet leaders had been, and he really was looking at the scene and saying, we have to change. The Soviet Union has to change because we're not going to survive if we don't. And so he was really looking for ways to reform the Soviet Union and stop in this battle, this spending battle with the United States of kind of missile for missile, because the Soviet Union wasn't able to hang with the U.S., as it were. Okay, so Reagan was pushing for reforms in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and Gorbachev was willing to consider many of those reforms. They met at a series of summits in the 1980s. And they signed a really famous arms control pact in 1987, which helped to bring down the number of nuclear weapons that were pointed at each other. And this was a man that Reagan could deal with. And so Gorbachev was seen as somebody that was possible to negotiate with, and that we might actually be able to move through and outside of the Cold War eventually. So let's take a break for just a minute and talk about the culture of the 1980s. And life in the 1980s was very interesting because, just like with the politics of the time switching towards the conservative side, the culture in the 1980s did as well. So we saw kind of a change away from the kind of freewheeling hippie era where we were living in communes and we were talking about sharing money and wealth and things of that sort, to something that was much more conservative and focused on consumption and personal consumption. And we went from hippies, which really were those folks that were looking at ways to kind of change the society, to something called yuppies. And what yuppies stood for was young urban professionals. So these were young people coming of age in the 1980s that were really looking for a good job with good pay so they could buy cool stuff. And they were looking for, it was all about labels, it was all about conspicuous consumption. So wearing the best designers, making sure you were driving your BMW, making sure you had your brand new fancy cell phone, all those kind of things were happening in the 1980s, and there was a real shift towards focusing on me as opposed to the society. At the same time, we had a number of societal issues that have always been there. We've always dealt with these issues, but they certainly became more and more of an issue in the 1980s. And these are problems that we were trying to deal with. One was drugs. One of the biggest issues in the 1980s was crack cocaine. There was an epidemic of crack cocaine, very easy to get a hold of, and was leading to huge issues both with crime and also with dependency that was happening in the 1980s. We also had the rise of AIDS. So, the very first cases of AIDS hit in the early 1980s, and it was a long time before we really got a handle on that, and that hit obviously different parts of our society very hard, and was killing a number of people. Very young people, very vibrant people were dying early in their lives to the AIDS epidemic. And then crime also was an issue, because we now had more of a society that was split into the haves and the have-nots. The poverty issues became more of an issue, and the wealth issues were really separated. So the idea, we had the very wealthy and we had the very poor, and that oftentimes led to crime. Also in the 80s, we had huge technological advances. Remember, this is the time frame when we're talking about the rise of the personal computer. So now, instead of just big businesses having a computer that took up a whole room, you could have mom and dad could buy a computer for their family, and schools had computers in them. And of course, they're nothing like what we have today, but they were the first ability for us to have that kind of power and that kind of devices in our homes. We also had big rises in technology related to TV. Cable TV became an issue. One of the big programs, especially for young people, was MTV, and I can remember watching videos over and over and over again until my parents told me to turn that thing off, from MTV all the way through the 1980s. We also had some changes in our space technology. You remember we talked a little bit about what was happening with space in the 1960s and the race to the moon. That changed a little bit, and we moved to the space shuttle. The idea that space could be used as a place that we could have people living all the time. We could have the space station, we could have the shuttle going up there and being reused, and so we were looking at space a little bit differently in the 1980s as well. One of the big things that happened in the late 1980s that really has kind of led to the part of history that we're in today was that the Cold War ended. So the Cold War, obviously, as we've talked about, started at the end of World War II with the downfall of most of the European countries and the rise of the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and it ran all the way until the late 80s. But essentially, with the policies of that Reagan had started with Gorbachev, and George H.W. Bush, our new president in 1988, continued, we started to see the Soviet Union starting to back off and lead to reforms. And so instead of being a hard-nosed communist country that controlled the Eastern Bloc nations, the Warsaw Pact nations, the Soviet Union was starting to lose a little of its influence and began something called reforms. And so Mikhail Gorbachev, started these reforms that were called glasnost, and it led to revolutions in many of the countries of Eastern Europe. So instead of being under the thumb of the Soviet Union, they wanted their freedom. That started in Poland, it went to the Czechoslovakia, and ultimately led to what has become really the focal point of both the Cold War and the end of the Cold War, and that was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And you can see a picture here of that from 1989. And essentially, very soon thereafter, the Soviet Union collapsed. It ceased to be a country. It fell into a number of different countries, one of which is the current center of that former Soviet Union called Russia that we have today. And because of this fall of the Cold War, we started to realign a little bit in terms of the power structure. And instead of having these two giants kind of facing each other off and using the world as its battlefield, we had these small little regional wars that would pop out again. And one of them was the Gulf War. And we'll call it Gulf War I because we've actually fought a couple of wars in the Gulf between the 1980s and our current day. But in the 1990s, in 1990 exactly, the country of Iraq, with the dictator Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait. Kuwait is a small country. It's an oil-rich country, and Iraq saw that as part of its former territory and wanted to take it over, and it felt that it had gotten kind of an okay from the United States to do that, and it invaded Kuwait in 1990. A coalition of forces under the United Nations said you can't do that. You can't take over another country just because you want to. You have to leave. And Saddam Hussein said, I'm not going anywhere. And so the UN launched a war, essentially a battle, called Operation Desert Storm in 1991 to push the Iraqis from Kuwait, which they did. This was one of the first times that the United States had actually fought a war on Middle Eastern soil. Okay, and this is really important with the rise of terrorism that we see coming in the early 2000s, because the United States now has bases in the Middle East. It has bases specifically in Saudi Arabia, which is seen as kind of the center point of the Islamic world. And this leads to a lot of Muslims being very upset with the idea of non-Muslims being in Saudi Arabia, this holy land. Some of those people ultimately will become the Taliban and Al-Qaeda as we go through history here, and we look at that in the next unit. So that's a little bit about the 1980s. It was really a transitionary decade. A lot of things going on. Like I said, the end of the Cold War, some changes in terms of shifting from a more progressive society to a more conservative society, and then just really crazy music and fashions too. So we'll learn more about this as we go, and we'll talk to you next time.